don't want to be part of that. Or who want to push to expand it. I mean, it could go either direction.
Hi, so my name is Jerome. I'm a grad student here. And so I was wondering, in terms of shifts in beliefs, how much in the physical culture, how much of this is often driven by war? Because if you think about like fiscal expansion, a lot of it was just the necessity of the war. And I've always wondered, it seems like at the beginning of the war, I mean, if you look at patterns, very often like they need to raise taxes like very fast. At the beginning, they try to finance it by just raising debt, and then at some point they need to increase taxes, and then you have like war taxes that are 90-something% for the top income brackets that are crazy, and then it goes back down, but not quite at the same level as it was before. And I've always wondered, it seems that they maintain a fiction for some time, at least at the beginning of the war. This is only temporary, and then it will go back to normal. And then, you know, when the war ends, there's like this whole, like, you know, how do we reshape the world? And it's just like law that's happening. And then, maybe this is like the moment where you can like kind of, you realize that you have a new kind of state of the world, and because the reality is so different, it's just, we try, like this fiction is falling apart, and then you can just readjust. Like this is when you realize that, you know, the beliefs have actually changed. And I mean, I know very little about this, but my sense is that both world wars, I mean, led to an expansion of the state capacity because of the war effort, and then this apparatus was later on used to, you know, finance welfare states. I mean, once the state is involved in the economy, so maybe this is like a vantage point for those shifts in beliefs and fiscal policy.
Well, there's no question that war plays that role. No question, and both Edgar and I have written about that, and so have lots of other people. And it will, if this becomes a book, it will certainly appear there. But what we're struggling with is the things that aren't war, right? There are large periods of peace or relative peace. War might get used as an excuse, small wars sometimes. So if you think about 19th century Europe, or you think about medieval France, even before it was totally France, war gets used as a way to collect taxes, but it doesn't necessarily get sustained. It gets sustained later, in later periods, and gets used in a variety of ways. But the really interesting question is, you know, I think some of the more, at least to me now, are some of the more domestic issues. Not that war doesn't play a part, or the geopolitics don't play a part. They obviously do. That's why I said fiscal culture is part of the story, and the domestic sources of fiscal culture are part of the story, but they can't be the whole story.
Sigrid was next, but Stephen had a two-hand.
Yeah, this was just on the war thing. So I was thinking about the war questions as well, less in terms of the direct effect on, you know, tax and spending, which as you said has, you know, had a long history in the literature, but more on sort of the indirect effects on how does it change what you call fiscal culture. So you need to trace through those in a larger project. So I mean, you see lots of ways in which war or military necessity has an effect on longer term who the we are. Like so in Peasants and Frenchmen, right at the beginning of that book, they say this is a problem in Napoleon's you know, army, that lots of people who are fighting don't seem to realize that they're French. And so it's seen as a military strategic issue that you need to enlarge the sense of who the we are. Right, and that then is going to have knock-on effects in terms of whether you think your fate is linked to other people. Or you could look at the American politics literature, which sees that people who fought in World War II and were drafted and came into contact with lots of dissimilar people and thought of themselves as we, then have different views about social policy 20, 30 years into the future than people who don't get those kind of draft experiences in war. So, you know, I'm not thinking of it in just the direct sense of how does war have an effect on spending, but the indirect cultural sense. And if you can get a handle on that, then you can also work out which of these other levers that you're talking about are having an effect on.
Yeah, that does build on what you were. Yeah.
Consuelo.
Can I also have I'm Consuelo. Can I also add a comment to the war thing? And if it's a civil war and there's a counterinsurgency campaign, I think it's really interesting to see how the state decides, you know, where to go, because you need to hold and clear and occupy territory that you wouldn't have otherwise because you need to win the war, and then maybe even develop those areas so that actually the rebels don't go back to fighting. So I think that plays a really interesting part of your story.
Yeah, good, useful, thank you.
Is that on this point, Sigrid had her hand up too?
You're gonna wait for Sigrid?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I don't have anything on war, so.
Okay, Sigrid.
I want to echo your Millie's point about or acknowledgement that this is really a fascinating project, like thinking about taxation and spending as a coherent whole. I mean, really together as part of the same thing. I agree. I don't think there's anyone who has done it systematically, and it's of course super challenging. But I mean, if anyone is up to it, then it would be you, I think.
We'll see.
Mm-hmm. So I keep grappling with like how you conceptually distinguish community of faith from, or like which for community of faith from other aspects that feed into a fiscal culture, and whether you can have this similar fiscal cultures, say like high, very redistributive, very progressive, like high taxation levels progressively that are also within the taxation system that is highly progressive, whether you can have that for different reasons, the same kind of principles. And because I keep like returning to the Alesinger Glaser research on heterogeneity or versus homogeneity, because it seems to me that it's fairly obvious that you don't need to do a lot of work to construct a community of faith if you have a homogeneous society. The sense of we is much easier. It is basically already present. So the interesting thing is what happens to societies that are heterogeneous. And this is where I think possibly like it might be that like the state tradition plays a really important role. So the state tradition, how the state formation process occurs. Is it from above? So like if you have a strong, like Germany, is it now the example that's floating around in my brain right now? Like a very heterogeneous society, but strong order, like, and so order liberalism as a set of elite ideas from above, like gets created, creates this welfare state that is very redistributive, and there isn't really a sense of we that produces it. And then you have like this the from below, like say Sweden, where like farmers and workers together bring about this kind of system. And so then it would be interesting to develop a typology potentially of like that has like maybe a 2x2 to start with, like state tradition, a strong absolutist or authoritarian state tradition versus weak one, and then heterogeneous society versus homogeneous society. So to have this societal and state dimensions mapped out, and then that would explain, I mean, the U.S. tradition, the U.S. case much better, I think, than simply the Alesinger Glaser. I mean, they kind of do look at political institutions, so questions whether that already exists, but I don't know. I mean, they don't really compare across cases. They compare U.S. and Europe,
right,
and like lump all of Europe together as one case. So like that's obviously
a little disturbing.
Yes. Yeah. So, but that would be interesting. That like there's no central state, like in a very heterogeneous society, so that like nothing emerges from below and nothing emerges from above. So that it would be one thought. And like regarding the change over time, I'm not sure. I'm convinced that there is a shift, like that there's like really profound change in the U.S. over time. I think there is some oscillation, but I was just thinking about the Great Depression and the public opinion surveys, which start right then on attitudes towards, unemployment protection and all that, and it's actually remarkably anti, even in the midst of the Great Depression. Like vast majority of Americans doesn't support like benefits for the unemployed.
Right.
And curiously, like when Reagan starts like in 1980, when all these cuts happen, 1982, 1983, like that's not supported by a shift in public opinion. Public opinion opposes that. So that's relatively stable. So these policy shifts happen even though there is no underlying change in the in solidarity, in the level of solidarity from below. Not sure, like, how you would pin that down, that change.
You throw a lot of things at me,
Yeah.
so I do think we are moving, or will have to move towards some kind of typology, and we already identified as something that we have to play with much more than we had so far in the couple months that we've been working on this. The heterogeneous versus homogeneous dimension. And there are a variety of ways in which that comes into play as well. So it's not as easy as religious or ethnic or racial. I mean, it's also political, and there are a lot of dimensions to heterogeneous versus homogeneous there that we have to play with. So that's one. The above and below stuff, I'm hearing much more today than I've heard before. So I've just got to figure out, one, what I said in the paper that is generating that, and two, what to do with it, because I'm hearing some very interesting suggestions, and I just need to pull them together. It's not coming out of my brain right away how to handle that. The last question you raised, Sigrid, remind me what you. Sorry, I didn't write it down.
It's not so like the change over time in
The change
fiscal
over time.
culture. Is there really a change over time in the culture, in fiscal culture? Is it just some oscillation within like a relatively stable given culture?
No, I think that's a very good empirical question, and I don't know the answer to that. And that's part of what we're going to have to figure out. I'm not sure that I would go by. My own instinct is that I wouldn't use surveys, public opinion surveys, as the way to get at that. That's one thing I'd at least be in my own. I'd be worried about. And because I'm very worried about a lot of those public opinion, just as I was about the trust ones. I'd have to really look at how the questions were formulated to see if they're really getting at what we think they're getting at. And I know the trust questions were not getting at what we think they should have been getting at. So it's an open question to me. That's one of the reasons. But another reason is that they're fine. Maybe they're okay, but that's a very short period of history in which you have those kinds of surveys. So it wouldn't be what you'd use, say, if you're looking at 19th century.
But what would you have then that gives you like from below the solidarity dimension? That's because then.
Well, maybe they do and maybe they don't. As I said, I'd have to make my own judgment about them, and they might. But the other part of that is that I think that this. Again, there's a multi-dimensional aspect to this. So it's not just whether there's popular support or not for social welfare expansion or contraction, but also what people are feeling about government more generally and whether it should be austere or not austere, which then has some other implications to it. So if there's a shift in the view of whether government should be a big spender or a little spender, people may not, they don't always understand what that means. They say, well, we don't want people who are poor to lose money, we don't want education to decline, we don't want the military to get worse, but we've got to reduce the budget in big government. And then you get funny answers on these questions because they don't put that together. So anyway, I will look at the population. We'll look at that, but the bigger question is that we don't really have our metrics together yet.
Ellen Lust had a two.
I have a two thing. I'll come back to my one finger thing, but it was to say, okay, what would you look at? And it actually gets a bit more to kind of unpacking when you're taking the cultures of fate into the fiscal spending and the taxation, exactly sort of what dimensions are there. Because I'm hearing there's a question of basically who should get it, right? So who's in the community, right? And then the question about sort of exactly how much should be, what should be given, what the mutual obligations are, right? In particular with regards to government. That's great, but can you? Is there a way that this is not the point at the beginning too? But can you help to unpack just a little bit more for me? Kind of exactly what the dimensions are when you're linking those two, and what other evidence you actually look at? Because I'm quite curious actually if it's going to be, how can you sort of dig this up, or can you look at?
I'm not sure I can unpack it a whole lot